Today we're counting down the top 10 deadliest explosives of the Wild West. The blasts that shook boomtowns, stopped trains in their tracks, and terrified outlaws and lawmen alike. And it wasn't just dynamite. From forgotten Civil War shells to improvised powder bombs, these were the weapons that turned the frontier into a battlefield. One wrong spark could erase an entire town in seconds. And the number one explosive on this list didn't just kill, it rewrote the very rules of survival in the American West. And hey, if you love digging into the real weapons of the Wild West, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more firepower coming. Number 10, signal flares and powder charges. The fireworks of the frontier that could kill as easily as they could save.
Picture holding a metal tube packed with volatile powder designed to shoot a blinding fireball into the night sky. On the battlefield, a flare was a lifeline, a streak of light visible for nearly 20 miles, burning at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. In the wrong hands, it was a weapon. A fireball hot enough to ignite wood, canvas, or flesh in seconds. Soldiers relied on them to coordinate cavalry patrols across the plains. Miners kept powder charges ready to set off underground blasts. Outlaws? They used them as crude incendiaries, sending lawmen running when the sky lit red. But there were no safety standards on the frontier. Mishandle one of these signals, and you weren't just asking for trouble, you were holding a bomb with no fuse. One Arizona mining camp became infamous after a drunken brawl ended with a flare fired indoors. The result? A canvas tent reduced to ash in minutes, 3 men scarred for life, and a story that spread faster than the fire itself. The psychological weight was undeniable. When lawmen saw an outlaw camp fire a flare into the sky, they didn't just see a signal. They saw a promise of chaos to come. Yet for all their danger, flares and charges sat at the bottom of the explosive food chain. They were deadly accidents waiting to happen, not sea-leveling weapons. And if a signal meant to call for help could wipe out a camp, imagine what happened when entire wagons of powder went up in smoke. Number 9. Explosive cartridges and magic bullets. The phantom bullets of the frontier that promised firepower beyond imagination. They called them magic bullets. Rounds so deadly they didn't just pierce a target, they were said to explode inside it. Frontier newspapers whispered about them in the late 1800s. Tiny cartridges packed with chemicals or powder that could detonate on impact. It sounds like something ripped straight from Hollywood. But this myth had roots in reality. During the Civil War, European gunsmiths experimented with specialty ammunition. Hollow bullets filled with powder or unstable chemicals. One favorite was mercury fulminate, so volatile it could detonate from nothing more than a hard tap. A handful of these rounds crossed the Atlantic, ending up in the hands of collectors and frontier marksmen. But here's the truth. While they were real, they were wildly impractical. Misfires were common, accuracy was terrible, and they were more likely to blow up in the shooter's own gun than in an enemy. Still, the idea of explosive bullets spread fear across the West. Newspapers claimed assassins carried rounds that could shatter bone like glass. Gunfighters swapped stories of enemies felled by cartridges that turned flesh into fire. The reality? No hardened outlaw or lawman relied on them. Standard lead rounds were far more reliable and far deadlier in practice. One legend tells of a gambler in Dodge City bragging that he carried cartridges filled with mercury fulminate. Whether true or not, no one wanted to test him at the card table. Sometimes just the threat of an explosive round was enough to change a fight before a shot was ever fired. And that's why this myth makes the list. Explosive cartridges weren't common, but their reputation was explosive all the same. A reminder that in the Wild West, fear was often just as dangerous as firepower. But if the idea of a single bullet could spark this much terror, imagine the destruction when entire horns of powder were packed and primed for battle. Number 8. Powder horns and small charges. The everyday survival tool that doubled as a ticking time bomb.
It looked harmless, a simple, curved horn dangling from a settler's belt, but inside was enough black powder to level a cabin with a single spark. Before metallic cartridges became common, the powder horn was as essential to a frontiersman as his rifle. Hunters, soldiers, and pioneers all carried them, hollowed-out animal horns filled with the fine black powder that fed their weapons. A typical horn held nearly half a pound of powder, enough to turn a campfire accident into a blast that could rip through a cabin wall. In skilled hands, it meant survival. In careless hands, it meant disaster. Accidents were disturbingly common. Stray sparks from a campfire, an enemy shot clipping the horn, even careless loading could ignite the entire supply. One recorded incident near Fort Laramie described a soldier whose horn exploded as he primed his musket, killing him instantly and injuring 2 others nearby. And he wasn't alone. Frontier newspapers occasionally carried grim reminders of men turned into fireballs by their own gear. For native warriors and militias, powder horns weren't just practical, they were symbolic. Many were carved with animals, battle scenes, or personal emblems, a reminder that each horn carried not only powder, but a man's identity. To lose one in a fight meant more than running out of ammo. It meant humiliation, even dishonor. But with that pride came danger. A powder horn was exposed, fragile, and one mistake away from catastrophe. Soldiers knew it, hunters knew it, and outlaws knew it too. The sound of powder horns rattling on a belt was the sound of risk itself. And if half a pound of powder strapped to one man could cause carnage, what do you think happened when an entire wagon load went up? Number 7. Powder wagons and supply explosions. Rolling bombs that could wipe out half a town in seconds.
On the frontier, few sights were more feared than a wagon creaking under the weight of powder kegs. To settlers, it was a supply lifeline. To soldiers, it was fuel for battle. But to everyone else, it was a moving death trap. A single wagon might carry dozens of kegs, each one packed with up to 25 pounds of black powder. That meant a load of nearly 500 pounds of explosive force, enough to level an entire block of frontier buildings if it went off at once. Accidents were tragically common. In 1874, a supply wagon outside Dodge City caught fire. Witnesses said the blast shattered windows for blocks, killed both drivers instantly, and set nearby buildings ablaze. The town smoldered for hours. And this wasn't unique. From Colorado mining camps to Texas cavalry trains, powder wagons went off like rolling volcanoes, leaving nothing but ash and splinters in their wake. For outlaws, the risk was opportunity. Ambushing a wagon train loaded with powder wasn't just a robbery, it was high-stakes terror. Gunfire near the kegs was enough to make even the boldest bandits think twice. Stagecoach companies often posted guards specifically to keep nervous hands away from the rolling bombs. The dread was overwhelming. Settlers would scatter when they heard a wagon load rumbling down a trail, mothers dragging children indoors until the danger passed. And soldiers, marching beside supply wagons, knew they were only ever one misstep away from being obliterated by their own cargo. Powder wagons were the ultimate paradox. The same supply lines that kept frontier armies alive could erase them in an instant. They weren't just transport, they were time bombs on wheels. And if entire towns could be shaken to rubble by exploding wagons, imagine the chaos when outlaws started deliberately building bombs of their own. Number 6. Homemade powder bombs. The improvised weapons that turned the frontier into a minefield. They weren't factory-made or carefully engineered. They were coffee tins, satchels, or even wooden boxes stuffed with loose black powder and scraps of metal. These were the makeshift bombs of the Wild West, crude, unpredictable, and devastating when they worked. Frontier life bred ingenuity, and that included the darker side of survival. Vigilantes used homemade charges to defend ranches, while outlaws sometimes planted them as booby traps in hideouts. They were cheap, easy to build, and terrifyingly unstable. One outlaw gang in New Mexico was said to have rigged a cabin door with a powder-filled can, set to blow the moment lawmen kicked it in. The aftermath was chaos. 2 deputies injured and the rest too rattled to press forward. The power of these improvised bombs wasn't in their reliability. It was in the fear they created. No sheriff wanted to risk his men walking into a cabin that could erupt in flames. That psychological edge often bought outlaws time to escape, even when the devices never actually detonated. But when they did go off, the destruction was shocking. A satchel charge crammed with 5 pounds of powder and nails could tear through a saloon wall in an instant. Unlike dynamite, which was designed for controlled blasts, homemade bombs were pure chaos in a box. The danger didn't stop with lawmen. Plenty of would-be bomb makers blew themselves up in the process. Loose powder, unstable containers, and a single spark from a lantern were all it took. Homemade powder bombs were reminders that the Wild West wasn't just dangerous because of the weapons everyone carried openly. Sometimes the deadliest threats were the ones you never saw until it was too late. And if these improvised charges could terrify towns with nothing but powder and scrap, imagine the devastation when leftover shells from America's bloodiest war were unleashed on the frontier. We're only halfway through this list.
If this has already blown your mind, hit that like button and drop a comment down below. It helps more people discover the real story of the Wild West, not just the Hollywood version. All right, let's get back to it. Number 5. Civil War surplus shells and grenades. The deadly leftovers of America's bloodiest war that refused to stay buried. After the Civil War ended in 1865, tens of thousands of tons of munitions were left scattered across the country. Some were stockpiled at frontier forts, others sold off, and many simply abandoned. And when veterans, settlers, and outlaws pushed west, those explosives often came with them. Among the most feared were surplus artillery shells and hand grenades. A typical Civil War shell might weigh 12 pounds, packed with black powder and fitted with a crude fuse. Leftover Ketchum grenades, strange finned hand bombs, also surfaced, turning up in pawn shops or military caches. The problem? These devices were never designed for safe storage. Decades later, their fuses grew unstable, and a bump, a spark, or even a fall could set them off. One Kansas newspaper in the 1870s reported on a farmer who found an old Union artillery shell while plowing. Thinking it harmless, he used it as a doorstop, until a spark from the hearth set it off, demolishing half his cabin. Other reports told of children playing with grenade casings only to trigger hidden charges still active inside. The West was littered with time bombs left over from a war many settlers barely remembered. For outlaws, Civil War munitions were both a prize and a curse. A stolen shell might be turned against a bank vault or sheriff's office, but carrying it was like walking around with death under your arm. Even hardened criminals often left them behind, too unstable to trust. The anxiety was immediate. A town that discovered a cache of shells didn't see opportunity. They saw disaster waiting to happen. Soldiers, farmers, and lawmen alike treated surplus munitions with a mix of curiosity and terror. These weren't new inventions. They were ghosts of an older war, explosives that kept killing long after the battles ended. And if forgotten shells could wipe out cabins and scatter towns, imagine what happened when new inventions like TNT began appearing on the frontier.
Number 4. TNT, Trinitrotoluene. The latecomer that Hollywood made famous, but the frontier barely touched. Invented in 1863, Trinitrotoluene, better known as TNT, would eventually become one of the most destructive explosives of the modern age. Pound for pound, it packed a bigger punch than dynamite, and unlike unstable black powder, it could be stored and handled with far less risk of accidental detonation. In theory, it was the perfect explosive. In practice, the Wild West saw very little of it. The problem was timing. TNT wasn't adopted as a blasting explosive until the 1890s and early 1900s, right as the frontier era was coming to a close. Mining companies experimented with it late in the 19th century, but outlaws and settlers almost never laid hands on it. The cartridges were expensive, specialized, and rarely shipped in bulk across the frontier. Yet, TNT still earns its place on this list, not because it was common, but because of the reputation it gained later. Hollywood loved TNT. Bundles of red sticks tied together with a sizzling fuse became the shorthand for frontier destruction. Stagecoach robberies, train heists, saloon explosions, on-screen, TNT was everywhere. But the reality was that most of those explosions were powered by good old dynamite, not TNT. That doesn't mean TNT was irrelevant. A handful of frontier newspapers reported on experimental charges used in late mining operations, claiming they could shatter rock faces faster than dynamite. To men working underground, that meant more gold, more silver, and a faster way to blast through the unforgiving terrain. The fear factor came not from its real use in the West, but from the myth it carried. By the time Hollywood rewrote the story, TNT had become the king of explosives in the public imagination, even though the real West barely saw it. And if TNT was the mythic giant of frontier firepower, the next entry was the small, unglamorous device that made every big blast possible. Number 3. Blasting caps and detonators.
The small spark that unleashed the West's most powerful blasts.
They weren't big, they weren't flashy, and most people never even saw them. But blasting caps and detonators were the hidden killers of the frontier. Tiny devices that made every dynamite blast, every TNT charge, and every mining explosion possible. Without them, the Wild West wouldn't have echoed with the thunder of controlled destruction. A blasting cap looked harmless.
a slim metal tube filled with mercury fulminate or another shock-sensitive compound. But that innocence was deceptive. A single cap was so unstable, it could detonate from the tap of a hammer or the scrape of a boot. In skilled hands, it was a tool. In careless hands, it was a death sentence. For miners, blasting caps were a revolution. Instead of fumbling with dangerous fuses, they could set charges with precision, bringing down rock walls, carving tunnels, and opening up ore veins. But those same caps fell into other hands, too. Outlaws learned quickly that without a cap, dynamite was just a stick. With one, it was a weapon that could rip open a safe or derail a train. Frontier papers occasionally told grim stories of men killed not by dynamite itself, but by the detonators they carried in their pockets. A miner in Nevada was reportedly blown apart when a blasting cap ignited as he stumbled on a rocky trail. Lawmen knew it too. Raiding an outlaw stash meant risking boxes of caps so unstable they could erupt before anyone touched a fuse. The fear of detonators was unique. Everyone feared dynamite, but those who worked with explosives feared the caps more. They were the invisible trigger, the silent spark that could erase a man in an instant. Blasting caps weren't glamorous, but they were the beating heart of every explosion on the frontier. Without them, there is no dynamite, no TNT, no mining boomtowns, just silence. And if these tiny tubes were dangerous enough to terrify the men who made their living with them, imagine the devastation caused by the explosive kegs that powered the entire frontier.
Number 2. Black powder kegs. The backbone of frontier firepower and the most feared cargo in the West. Long before dynamite or TNT, the Wild West ran on black powder. Every rifle, every musket, every cannon, every mine, all of it depended on barrels of the stuff. And those barrels weren't small. A single keg might hold 25 pounds of powder. Wagons carried them by the dozen. Forts stored them by the ton. In an era of firelight and open flames, it was like living on top of a volcano. Black powder wasn't just fuel for weapons, it was fuel for disaster. Powder mills across the frontier exploded so frequently that locals nicknamed them hell factories. A careless spark or a stray ember could turn an entire settlement into rubble. In 1862, a powder magazine in Pittsburgh erupted with such force that windows shattered a mile away, and the blast was heard like thunder across the countryside. The West was filled with stories just like it. For soldiers, powder kegs meant victory or defeat. Civil War veterans carried that reliance westward, using powder to fuel their weapons and artillery. For miners, a single keg meant the difference between striking gold or staying poor. For outlaws, it meant opportunity. Robbing a wagon loaded with powder gave them both money and a weapon of terror. But everyone knew the risk. Powder kegs were so unstable that even rolling one the wrong way could crack a seam, spilling fine powder across the ground. And once powder dust was in the air, it took nothing more than the flame of a match to set it off in a chain reaction. The terror was constant. To live near a powder magazine was to live with the knowledge that your entire town could vanish in an instant. Black powder was the great equalizer of the frontier, essential for survival, yet capable of reducing an entire town to rubble in seconds. And if black powder kegs were the backbone of frontier firepower, then the final entry on this list was the explosive that redefined it entirely. Number 1. Dynamite. The king of frontier explosives, the blast that redefined the Wild West.
When Alfred Nobel patented dynamite in 1867, the American frontier would never be the same. Suddenly, miners could shatter rock faces that once seemed impenetrable. Railroad companies could carve tunnels through mountains at a pace that transformed the landscape. And outlaws quickly realized dynamite wasn't just a tool. It was the perfect weapon of terror. A single stick of dynamite carried more destructive force than entire powder horns. Bundled together, it could topple bridges, derail trains, and tear open bank safes. In Butch Cassidy's time, the Wild Bunch became notorious for using dynamite in train robberies. On more than one occasion, their charges blew the entire express car to pieces, along with the money they were trying to steal. Dynamite wasn't precise, it was raw chaos, and the West had never seen anything like it. But dynamite wasn't just an outlaw's weapon. It built the West as much as it scarred it. Mining towns from Colorado to Nevada sprang to life because dynamite allowed prospectors to blast through rock at record speeds. Railroad barons drove steel rails through mountains, stitching together a nation. Dynamite made it possible. The danger, of course, was ever present. Early sticks sweated nitroglycerin, weeping volatile liquid that could explode with a single jolt. Wagons transporting dynamite sometimes went up in fireballs that left nothing behind but scorched earth. Workers and lawmen alike treated every stick with dread.
knowing one slip meant death. Psychologically, dynamite changed the rules. Guns might settle a duel, but dynamite could decide the fate of entire towns. It was the ultimate equalizer. A handful of sticks in the right hands could outmatch dozens of armed men. And that's why dynamite stands at number 1. It wasn't just another explosive. It was the blast that built railroads, fueled robberies, destroyed lives, and rewrote the very survival code of the Wild West.
So there you have it, the top 10 explosives of the Wild West. From simple signal flares that could torch a camp to dynamite, the blast that built railroads, fueled robberies, and terrified the frontier. The truth is, the West wasn't just conquered by six-shooters and rifles. It was carved, scarred, and forever changed by the power of explosives. Some saved lives, others destroyed them. All of them rewrote history in fire and thunder. If you enjoyed this countdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a like. It helps us bring even more of the real Wild West to life, far beyond the Hollywood myths. And if you thought these explosives were deadly, wait until you see the weapons we've already covered, from revolvers and rifles to knives and shotguns. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.